Welcome to the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm your hostess, Melanie Joy Pensack, here to share heartfelt conversations with folks recovering from CIRS and with those special people serving the CIRS community. The podcast was created to help bring awareness to the physical, emotional, and mental experiences of folks navigating CIRS day to day. The world needs to know what CIRS folks go through for deeper empathy and understanding. Through stories and vulnerability, we can help the world understand the winding journey of CIRS recovery. Thank you for being here to open your mind and to open your heart. I'm very excited today to have Michael Schrantz here on the Heart of CIRS podcast. Michael Schrantz is the founder and operator of Environmental Analytics, which is a comprehensive indoor environmental quality consulting company that covers a wide range of environmental assessments for the residential, commercial, and medical sectors. Mike has over 26 years of active indoor environmental quality and building science experience and has been involved in over 6,000 related projects expanding across the globe. Mike is highly recommended by treating physicians all around the world for his work with patients suffering from CIRS and many other medical diagnoses. Mike is on the board and committees of many esteemed platforms and has done wonderful work in the CIRS community. He recently had a talk at the CIRS X conference that is now live for everyone to be able to watch through the website on endotoxins. So highly recommend that people check that out. Mike is a certified indoor environmental consultant, microbial investigator, building inspector, and I think the most important quality, Mike has an excellent sense of humor and a big heart that he brings to his CIRS patients and the work that he does in the community. So thank you so much for being here, Mike. We really appreciate your time.
Melanie, thank you so much. I look forward to diving into these questions. These are some of my favorite interviews, so I'm ready when you are.
To point people to your own CIRS journey, can you share some key red flags, some symptoms that you experienced, and how you got to your own personal CIRS diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it crept up right prior to getting the formal diagnosis and reaching out to a few colleagues and friends who were in the functional world and CIRS and all that. I was under a lot of stress, working with a lot of people, and I tend to be a people person, so I'm typically connected and feel the stress that they're going to, and had to learn a little bit about healthy boundaries along the way. I know most of us that are listening probably have some level of that. And so that was creeping up in my life. I had also been really pushing myself stress-wise with my body. I had been working out. I've stressed my body with this diet that probably wasn't the best for me. And certainly there was some potential exposure to the environment concerns. And so it was like this perfect storm. And then I remember one day going to the gym, coming back to the office, and I remember looking at the stack of folders for clients and going, oh my gosh. And I didn't have a feeling of like gratitude and peace. I had a feeling of stress. Oh my gosh, it's just so much. And I literally had this feeling overcome me. It was almost like goosebumps on steroids, where it went down from the head to my feet, but it was unnerving how much had happened. Lost my appetite, really was scared. And that was kind of the start of this ride. And then shorter version was ended up getting like COVID not too long after. So it was like this 1-2 punch. And that was a priming event for me personally. And so when I look back at like red flags or symptoms, like for me, it was just, I think stress was probably my biggest red flag that I should have been paying more attention to read my body. My symptoms in the beginning, I got tired. I wasn't hungry, but soon afterwards, fatigue was number one for me. I was just beside myself in terms of I was tired. I'm like, what the heck's going on? And didn't realize how much I was taxing my body. That led to working with Roots and Branches. Ultimately, Dr. Eric Dorninger and a few of his colleagues were so gracious and patient to help me understand. I went through the journey of all the tests. I did all. If Dr. Dorninger, typically when you say, what kind of testing do you do? It's E, all of the above. So I went through this real big regimen to better understand my body, found out that I met the criteria for CIRS, and began my treatment from there. It's been really successful, and I know we're going to get into that in a second.
Where are you in terms of your recovery now?
I like to use the word healed. I'm definitely, if we want to get technical, I'm certainly on the VIP step, which is the last step of the Shoemaker protocol. I've been on it for a number of months, and really it's physically, emotionally, spiritually, I'm such a better place right now. I'm dealing with some other things that have to do with sciatica type related things. Sitting in front of a desk all day isn't the best for your health, which by the way might have been another factor contributing to the stress on my body. But yeah, definitely healed. I went through all the binder stuff. I went through the gut correction. I went through a lot of those different modalities that these Shoemaker certified doctors are looking at. If you've been going through this process, you probably have a shelf or a box full of your supplements. I'm popping pills left and right and really on the back end of it. So I've been very grateful because if I look back, Melanie, I feel like I'm in the dark and there's a lot of trust, a lot of faith you have to have in the process. But in hindsight, I look at that journey, which is packed with a bunch of experiences. I would say that if you have CIRS, the best thing you can do is follow the protocol because it's going to be the thing that helps you get out the quickest.
Thank you for sharing all of that. To see you to be able to travel, to go to CIRS, to go through the process of being on an airplane and presenting at a conference, that's definitely a testament to what can happen as you go through the Shoemaker protocol.
Definitely a sound check for me of, wow, you know what? I'm glad that there is this research and these doctors that are following honest work to treat the patient. There's a lot of unique differences from one patient to another, but the general framework has already been laid out for this illness. And for those of you that are newer to it, it's okay, what? I don't know my left from my right at this point, but I can tell you from personal experience and also as a professional experience as an observer working with clients with CRS around the globe, that it is admittedly to me, because I get this question all the time, is there's different camps and there's different modalities of treatment. I honestly can say to people that the Shoemaker protocol seems to be the most consistent. Not that it may work for everybody. That's not what I'm talking about. But if it is that, it seems like that feeling of peace and knowing that it's going to work was a warm blanket for me. It certainly was in the latter half of my treatment.
Let's shift gears into today's topic, which I'm excited to dive into with you because I get questions about this specifically, and I feel like HVAC systems, nobody wants to talk about or deal with when it comes to apartment hunting and house hunting. I work with a lot of patients, and in my own experience, they're like, okay, I have to learn about mold and I have to learn about signs to look for water damage. Then I need to think about smells and endotoxins and location of where I'm going to live. Then when they hear they might need to consider what the HVAC is doing in their home or apartment, it gets to be a little overwhelming. I want to dive into HVAC systems with you today to help simplify and clarify and just give people a basis of understanding around that. And people may not know that you've had a lot of experience in HVAC. So can you talk a little bit about your background in that and then how that has come into working with the CIRS population?
Sure. I was involved around HVAC from a family-owned company since I was 16. I was learning about airflow and just the design of a traditional air heating and air conditioning system in homes when I was going to high school. At the time, I didn't think I'd be doing what I'm doing today, but I continued to learn and eventually got involved with water damage complaints. And naturally, if you have an HVAC system, some things can happen, like you can have a condensation leak where water from the evaporator coil is draining moisture out of the air by part of its design, and that water leaks somehow, maybe some failure, some break, and that ends up being a wet wall, and maybe there's mold growth. We got involved in that, and that led to more challenging cases, like someone's complaining of not feeling good, and they were sending out other people, and these other companies weren't necessarily solving their problem. I had one of the best mentors, and I think in the industry, who's now passed away, my great uncle, Gary Gibson. He's got a patent in air exchange and like fresh air. I really had one up on a lot of the understanding that I didn't realize until now, the appreciation of where he was really showing how you can track a problem and take it back to its source and thus solve the problem. That influenced ultimately my decision to do the work that I'm doing now, because eventually I led the indoor air quality division at the company, went through college thinking I still was going to do something different, but taking the courses like the upper level certifications to really give myself the core fundamentals of the work I do. One day I just woke up and I said, I love this. I love being able to feel like I am helping people and I'm good at what I do. And so that I've been doing indoor air quality at that point since 1996 through the fundamentals, and opened up my doors in 2008 in September to do what I do now. Of course, that led to a whole other level of working with your average patient versus the CIRS population that we work with today.
Can you share about why it's so important to have a healthy HVAC and to know some basics about it?
Yeah, the HVAC system, especially if it is a ducted system, but even if it's not, like if it's a mini split ductless system where it's heating or cooling just on a wall mounted unit, but especially too, if it is a ducted system, is the lungs of the home. It's the thing that is helping the home breathe, to use a corny example. What's distributing conditioned air, heated, cooled, to the various locations throughout the home. Understanding that is fundamental because I know that there are a lot of people that have had bad experiences with HVAC systems, but when they're designed and operating properly, they're actually a benefit because they can help, for example, distribute filtered air throughout the home more effectively. They can help distribute fresh air that's being filtered and conditioned that came from the outside to then distribute through your home. It can help return contaminants back to the filter that then can help get removed from the home. When it's operating properly, beyond the comfort it provides us, which is huge, it can be a plus. It's very important to have the basic fundamentals of, okay, so if I am living in a home with an air conditioning system, where would be the areas I might want to keep an eye on? And one of the number one areas in a air conditioning system, something that cools the air, is going to be a thing called the evaporator coil, the part of the system that the air goes through that by design cools the air. And in the process of doing that, removes moisture. And in the process of doing that, builds up moisture. And by proper design, that moisture is going to be properly evacuated, exited, drained out of the drain pan through a condensate line to some appropriate location. But when that's not happening, or it's not happening efficiently, it's usually the first location where microbial growth can occur, which is why, at least in part, you hear, if you go online, a lot of horror stories about the HVAC system, is because those areas are often poorly maintained and monitored.
Great. I'd love for us to talk about some of the basic parts so that people can understand what they're supposed to ask about or look at when they ask about an HVAC. For me, when I think about apartment hunting prior to CIRS, I was so naive to HVACs. For me, it was basically, is there an HVAC? I wanted one because
Right.
living in warm locations and global warming, we can't get away from them at this point. I just wanted to know if it worked or not. That was the extent of that. But now there needs to be a more consideration. So we have the evaporator coils.
Yeah.
Talk about the drip pan. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So this drip pan, or sometimes it's referred to as a drain pan, it's interchangeable, is typically some sort of a plastic pan that is around the perimeter of what is called a coil housing. So that evaporator coil that I was just talking about is not open to the air, to your environment. It's enclosed in a box called a coil housing, and that's where the air is controlled to run through. Underneath that coil is a drain pan. It makes sense. Something's got to catch all that water. You don't want to just pull up in the unit. And so that drain pan is typically accessed by opening up a panel. Typically, it's done by an HVAC company, but there are some do-it-yourself folks out there to open up that panel, and you'll see the drain pan right there. In fact, you'll usually know where the drain pan's located because there's what's called a condensate line, typically a white piece of 1-inch diameter PVC that is ultimately going from this housing. You see it just tie right into it, and it's tied right into that drain pan, and then it exits to some appropriate location. Those are just in terms of basics. That's that whole system, the drain pan and the condensate line, are all culprits of areas that can have mold bacteria growth, even the drain line itself, because a lot of times water will sit or rest. A lot of times, for example, Melanie, the condensate line will have a P-trap in it to prevent odors or issues from coming back up in through the condensate line. So, for example, if that condensate line is tied into your sewage drain, so the same sewage system that your toilets and sink drains all hook up to, some designs, the condensate line is tied right into it. Can you imagine if, ooh, gross, like there was some sewage smells and it was able to go back up into that condensate line? It's the pathway. And then all of a sudden you're getting a sewer smell in your house. No fun. So they'll have this condensate, this P-trap that kind of helps block that, right? And if the irony is you want it to be filled with water to prevent it, but you also want to be mindful that it doesn't stay stagnant with that water, because then it can grow microbial growth, biofilms, bacteria, that sort of thing. The plenum, sometimes people heard this term, the plenum. And so if you were to draw like a traditional system in your mind right now, imagine it's out in your garage, okay? And you have or in your closet in your apartment, if it's one of these, you have a furnace. Then on top of that furnace, looking up, you have that evaporator coil. And right above the evaporator coil housing, that system right there, you have the plenum. And the plenum is the metal ductwork typically that ties to the system that helps you distribute the air to the other parts of the ducts, trunk lines, branch lines. It's all ductwork that go to their locations, your bedroom, your kitchen. A lot of times, if you're having a chronically moist environment in the evaporator coil housing, you won't just get microbial growth in or around the evaporator coil or on or near the drain pan. You'll get it right above on the plenum, because there's going to be moisture, enough moisture building up on that plenum. Typically, those plenums are insulated, Melanie, so it's like the perfect sponge to absorb moisture and be an ideal breeding ground for growth. When we talk to clients about areas to look at, if you have the ability without damaging your unit, especially if you're in a rental, to open up those systems, like that traditional system I told you, you would take a look at that, take a picture if you have to, some photos, a flashlight to see, are you seeing any evidence of microbial growth? And we can get into different conversations of what does it look like. If you do, that is a red flag to go, okay, we got to get this addressed because I might be having exposure. Don't forget to look up past the evaporator coil into the plenum, which you should be able to see in a lot of designs, and see, do I see evidence? Sometimes you can snake your hand up in there with your camera and take a few pictures. If you don't have the best angle, it might be a little dusty, but you definitely don't want to see patches of what looks like mold growth there.
What is the condenser?
There is some confusion in the industry about that. Sometimes when people hear condenser, they think that is part of a system where air is coming from it, or if mold's growing on it, it's a concern. A condenser is the condensing unit for most traditional homes, for example, and many apartments and that sort of living. You're going to have a unit that is outside called a condensing unit that has a compressor in it. And it's the device that pumps refrigerant, not air, from that location, the condensing unit, into that evaporator coil. It's just a loop. So the only thing that goes from the condensing unit outside to the evaporator coil, typically in your home, that we've discussed already, is the refrigerant. It's not really a concern for mold growth, because even if there was mold growth out there, it's not going to get into your house, certainly not through that method. That condensing unit, it's more of an issue of, and again, without getting too off the normal average design, because we can get into some weeds with, what if it's on my roof and they mounted it and now I have a roof leak? Those are different discussions. But to say to you, that's more of an issue of performance, for example, not to be too random. It doesn't always have to be about mold growth right now, but where I live in Arizona, it's hot and it's humid right now, and our systems are working overtime. And I actually go outside with a garden hose and spray down the condensing unit coils, because the system performs better and I actually get more efficient cooling for less cost. But no, your main flags are going to be, and we haven't talked about registers yet, but there's going to be the evaporator coil, the drain pan, the nearby plenum, and depending on your climate, although I wouldn't ignore it wherever you're at, your registers that are supplying the air, especially in warmer, humid climates. It's very common, unfortunately, to see condensation occur, because if you think about it, like just the basics, if you're cooling a surface like a metal register down to say 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, because this is the colder air coming out to cool your home, you're going to lower the surface temperature as well. That register is going to be the same temperature. The problem with that is if you have a register near, let's say, a sliding glass door to your backyard, and you open it up and warm, moisture-laden air from the outside hits that cold register, it's going to condense. And if that is a repeated offense, if it's something that happens on a somewhat regular basis, you'll get mold growth. In some situations, the growth will pass through the register itself and get into the actual box and nearby ductwork that supplies that register. That's another thing to pay attention to.
That's a great tip. I want to throw a couple situations at you for people that might be typical of when they're going into look for an apartment or a home. But before we get into that, I'm curious, is there anything that you can share about maybe a client that you've worked with who's had an HVAC issue, had some health issues related to it, and there's been a positive outcome working with it.
I'm thinking of more recently, happened less than, let's say, a year ago, where the daughter was diagnosed with CIRS. The mother was having signs of dementia, and the husband had the traditional attitude of mold's not a problem. So it was like this perfect trifecta of situations going on. And they were having a really hard time. They had me come out to their house, and turned out they did have a couple smaller issues going on throughout the home, like a drip leak in a kitchen sink thing. But the elephant in the room was they had a faulty humidifier installed in their HVAC system platform. So you can imagine there's a platform. Some of you are used to systems either being in closets or in garages, and it's raised on what's called a platform. And some of those platforms serve as ductwork, if you will, for the air to come through up through the furnace and get this loop. Mm-hmm. They had installed this humidifier into the platform to provide moisture-laden air in the wintertime, because it's Arizona and it's dry. And it leaked, and it was leaking for a long time, and mold and biofilm and bacteria were literally growing like a lake underneath this platform that was about 2.5 feet deep and about 5-6 feet wide, because it had a couple systems on it, water heater, that kind of thing. And the whole platform was exposed. And we had done a bunch of, some of it's obvious low-hanging fruit, but just for numerical evidence, we had done some testing. And one of the things that we had done was MSQ PCR DNA testing. Some of folks here know it as like an ERMI or a HERTSMI. And unsurprisingly, that particular zone came back with huge counts of Catonium, Stachy, a lot of the classic Aspergillus penicillium type species. That issue right there, the first thing, because they're in process right now dealing with it, we told them, please, because we had gone through hours of discussion and trying to work things out and sequence it, like what's the right order, and came to the conclusion, given the chaos of the situation, it was just better for them to temporarily relocate. And as soon as they did, their health improved just like that. And it was like, I can't guarantee that it was due to that, but it was so bad in that area that, and these are the lungs of the home, right? Both systems were sucking air. There was a 2-story home, and one was servicing the lower level, one was servicing the upper level, and the whole house looked bad. We couldn't quite at the time figure out, why is it so bad? It's not adding up to the drip leak in the kitchen that I mentioned earlier. There you go. Mm-hmm. And I've had other cases, to your point, Melanie, where we have improved it, their health got better, and that was the main culprit. Low-hanging fruit issues in homes, our top 3 are typically crawl space, if you have one underneath your home, HVAC systems, and probably a tie, depending on the argument and the location, between basements and attics. These are low-hanging fruit things that was probably the first place that you would look as an inspector.
Part of this podcast is to empower people to feel confident to go look at apartments and look at houses and know what they should be looking for in that process. If you were going to go and view an apartment, somebody you knew was going to view something, and they see a smaller individual, more condensed HVAC in the closet, and they say, hey, I want to look at this, to whoever, if they're with, who is showing the apartment, what could they look at, take pictures of, what questions should they ask that would be helpful, and what would be some red flags in that situation?
If we want to talk about red flags, meaning don't get the apartment based off of what you're seeing, I think the first thing is when you ask the question to the management or whomever that I would like to get access to the system, they should be willing to show you. A yellow flag is automatically if they're defensive. I'm already yellow flag if they're being resistant, because that tells me something about their potential attitude about addressing this and other issues that we haven't even talked about. But I would say questions to ask regarding the HVAC system is, can I please get access to the evaporator coil and take a look at it? And what is a red flag, right? Is it a square inch of mold on the drain pan? Is the evaporator coil housing covered in mold? I would say the latter is probably a red flag. Having a little bit of microbial growth in the drain pan, I don't typically find translates into numbers that we are identifying in the home to suggest cross-contamination. Not that there wouldn't be any. I don't want to split atoms here, but like from an appreciable quantitative number, that's not a deal breaker. That's more of an issue of, can you, management, please clean this, and or are you okay if you don't offer this If I'd have a maintenance program where I hire a local HVAC company to come in, say, for example, at the beginning and end of each summer season where you're working the cooling, the AC part, to make sure that there's nothing there. And if there is, that stuff is cleaned up. Because the reality, Melanie, and I know this better than I probably, is that you're not going to tell the management or the department that, can you reinstall a system that I know happens to be a great one, and that, and they're not going to do that. So it's about triaging what you can. But if you open up that coil and there's mold just throughout, and let's say that's more of a chronic or systemic issue, that's suggestive that there's a lot going wrong with the system, and you're not going to just solve it by cleaning it. It's going to, there's something different going on there that's probably outside of your willingness to give it a shot. It's a deal breaker for me. The other thing, which I glossed over earlier, so I'd like to just tag it real quick, is imagine the system again where you, if it is a furnace in a closet and it's on a raised platform, so it's sitting elevated, okay, and there is ductwork underneath. Sometimes a giveaway to the ductwork underneath is if you have a grill, a return air grill, where the air goes back into the furnace and it's right underneath the furnace, right on the wall. That's a dead giveaway. It's something that's there. But if you're paying attention, and you want to look underneath the furnace too, because there's this thing called gravity, right? If the evaporator coil, for example, has moisture and it's dripping down through the furnace, it will drip down through the furnace and down into that return plenum. We were talking about the supply plenum. There's technically two plenums. There's a plenum that services the return, which is usually less of an issue. And there's a plenum that services the supply, which is typically, when it is an issue, more of an issue. But if you have moisture dripping due to a condensate leak or whatever into that return plenum, so you imagine visually for us, you look inside the furnace, you look up into that evaporator coil house, and you have them open it up. You don't see much and go, oh, this looks great. Thank you very much for letting me do that. And then you didn't look down into that raised platform, and lo and behold, there's like rust and microbial growth. That is a red flag. So make sure, now not every system is going to be like that, Melanie. There's going to be, we haven't talked about those little first company fans that are up in the ceiling yet, but the traditional system that you will typically most see in most dwellings is going to be what we've been discussing. I would definitely call those things red flags, big significant growth in either of the plenum, massive amounts around the evaporator coil itself, but a little bit of a penny-sized, quarter size of microbial growth in the drain pan, or perhaps even in the condensate line. With respect to having CIRS and being conscious of exposure, that's not a deal breaker. That's a, let's get this cleaned up so I don't have to think about it.
That's really helpful to share with folks. In my own experience, I was able to complete something called a reasonable accommodation request. I had a disability lawyer. Each state has a disability rights department or organization of some sort. And I was able to connect with somebody to get free legal advice through that organization. She helped me to draft up the general reasonable accommodation request that has some legal jargon in it and links to housing authority laws. Basically, I wrote this letter out and I said, because I have an immune illness, I need to be able to have a professional inspection of my HVAC in the apartment done every year. If it's necessary, then having permission to decide on how it's cleaned, inspecting the drip pan, inspecting the parts that you've mentioned already here today. And then also being able to change the filters regularly and to be able to just keep things tidy in that closet. For whatever reason, in my apartment complex, they lock the HVAC closet, which drives me absolutely insane that I don't have control of that space. Once a month, what I'm able to do is get in there, and they change the filter. I'm able to vacuum, dust, look for water damage, anything that I need to. So there are ways, like you're pointing to, if it looks pretty good and it just needs a clean, there are ways to support yourself legally to get that done too.
Yeah, great point. Thanks for adding that, Melanie.
The next question would be, what about homeowners? So people are going to look at a home and they want to look at the HVAC, same situation. Is there anything different compared to that standard apartment unit to a housing unit?
I guess there's some parameters that change. Certainly still looking at these same components that we've been talking about is just as important. I think the difference becomes now as it's more of the investment to you. Part of the challenge that we see, and I know you know this, my wife is a realtor and works with people with CIRS, and so we get this a lot, is the question of is how much money are you going to bring as a handle all things maintenance, all things remediation, all things cleaning. Whether you want to talk about it or not, you have to mentally come prepared with a budget for that. Because to your question, if you're a home buyer and you do open up the HVAC system and there is a chronic mold problem going on in that system, you probably are looking at some level of redesign. Let's use a convenient example, Melanie, to illustrate the point. If I walk into a home that I want to buy and it's in Miami, Florida, hot and humid, and I open up that evaporator coil, or my realtor helps me schedule a local HVAC company to provide access to it because I don't own the home. I don't want to break anything and be liable. So I'm going to have them do it. They open it up and there is mold growing throughout there. Clearly, there's something not right with that. We're not looking for zero growth in the case of the example of the drain pan. We're hopeful it always stays clean. But at a minimum, beyond cleaning that, it's going to be a thing of, do we put UVC light that doesn't produce ozone to sterilize it and prevent that from happening in the future? Possibly minimum. Do we have to address the plenum that I just looked up at past the coil and it's moldy? Can't really clean mold on porous insulation, which means you're probably going to replace that plenum. Since you're replacing that plenum, oh, we know what's going to come up next. Is my ductwork contaminated? By the time you get done talking to it, you're just going to clean your ductwork anyway. Let's all just admit that. So then when you do, that's a cost. So does it cost $1,500 to install a new plenum? Maybe. Does it cost $500 to $1,000 to clean your ductwork? Maybe. Does it going to cost another $500 to $1,000? Depending on a couple of variables, to install the UVC light? Maybe. And do you walk away from every home? Because this is the problem, Melanie, is not what we really want. What we want is a home that has no problems. That's an easy answer. Congratulations, you found the home you needed. We're talking about the homes that have issues and where are you willing to go versus saying, no, too much, gonna walk from this one, not worth it to me. And in my humble experience, I feel like it really does boil down to budget. I'll say this very quickly. There's a well-known CIRS person in our community that lives locally, and this individual was looking for a home and found one and had me come out, and they had a significant mold problem in their HVAC system. But when they looked at the total picture of the home and how it met their needs, they were willing to spend, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it feels like a $10,000 remediation job to redo that, and they spent another $8,000 to install a new system because it was old. They called it a Frankenstein system, where it's basically just got a different parts from different manufacturers. It was really bad. So to land this airplane of a thought, are you willing to, as a homeowner, because it's different when you're renting, are you willing to spend the money to do these fixes, or are you going to walk? That's a subjective thing, Melanie, because it's not a red flag for me from a standpoint of exposure. It's a red flag to the home. It's a potential red flag to the home buyer if they're like, yeah, but my thing is my budget does not include that type of potential work. And so if I do see that, I'm going to have to walk. And I hate saying that to people because I'm always an advocate of trying to make something work for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ductwork is pretty significant. And if you're in a hot, humid climate, especially, you're likely going to face this issue more than myself, who's in a dry state like Arizona.
Great points. Okay, the next scenario would be if you walk into a rental unit or a hotel, you see a mini split, which these are common, very common in renovated Airbnbs. What should you look for here? What are some red flags?
If we're talking about, to your point, a mini split, now we're thinking about a wall-mounted unit, and really the evaporator coil and the drain pan are built into typically the bottom side or the front bottom side of those mini split systems. You would otherwise, and typically a lot of them, and if you're not sure, hire an HVAC company or knows what they're doing, but especially because you don't own it, is carefully open up the front panels. And typically they do allow you to open them almost like a hood on a car, because that's where their cheap, pathetic air filter is located to keep the filters, relatively speaking, clean. The filters that they use are probably good at stopping bird feathers. That's about it. But they're not the kind of stuff that we've talked about in other things. And you're looking again for a systemic issue versus a little onesie twosie. You got a little bit of mold or bacteria or some biofilm, some protozoa growing in some corner where of the drain pan where the water maybe sometimes sit.
Mhm.
That to me is not a deal breaker. It doesn't translate to a per milligram spores, a quick thing that is a real number. But if you open it up and there's mold growing all on that, now you don't have ductwork to deal with, so that's an issue, or that's a plus. But you might go, okay, am I willing to spend the money or talk about the reasonably assisted, the document and protocol that you mentioned earlier to have either them pay or worst case, okay, I'm not an advocate for the tenant having to pay for any of this for the record, but is it worth if your options are limited and this home otherwise works for you? Let's think about the rental, for example. Then is it worth it to have you pay to have those coils and system cleaned? Because that's way cheaper than the continued effort of trying to find a rental and spending hundreds, thousands of dollars in that pursuit.
Yeah.
But it's easier said than done when we're talking about a hotel. You ain't going to do that in the hotel that you're going to be in for an average of 1 to 3 nights. All I can tell you is, yeah, that's tricky. I think if we all knew what was actually hanging around the evaporator coils and drain pans of the average hotel room, mini split, or a ductless system, and we use that metric of if there's any growth we leave as the metric to stay or go, you wouldn't find one hotel room other than maybe one that was just built that year, hasn't used their HVAC system, because the problem is the maintenance. They're
Mhm.
not getting clean. They're not, this is not, you know, the metric of indoor air quality, although there are some programs out there that are exciting, and some companies are starting to realize the power, even from it's a monetary standpoint, to offer better indoor air quality, are still behind the curve of what our community, what your average homeowner would have, the average CIRS patient would want in their home, or in this case, the hotels. What I would tell you is this: I don't know that if you even had the ability to peek in the evaporator coil, sometimes you're up against a wall and you have a flashlight and you can peek in there and see, does it look horrible? You could do that. I don't know how much of a good idea it is to put your face right up in it, but you can look and see. I think the real challenge with that one, Melanie, is, well, what do you do with that information? My truth to you is that in many cases where it is a hotel room or some short stay, Airbnb, whatever, it's more of a walk the room, walk the home. Do you see anything that's low hanging? Listen to your body, but
Mhm.
be honest. If you are symptomatic, be honest. Is it my limbic system, my vagus nerve, whatever? Is it that kicking in right now? Because we've all been there. I've been there personally.
Yeah.
And it's, you know what? I think I'm my own worst enemy right now. Or is there something that you feel is like legitimate? Like you have to be ready for that. Then honestly, we can get into little tricks. Of do a VCS test and that sort of thing. But who's going to take the time to tell the apartments or a hotel staff, do you mind if I monitor myself in this hotel room that I may or may not stay in? Maybe, Melanie, the answer is yes. Maybe you take a chance, you rent the room that you're going to go in, you expose yourself. I hate using that term, and you maybe see how you feel. And if everything's feeling good and you have your portable air purifier, and we'll talk about that in a second, or you've done a VCS test, which is it's a pain in the butt to do. I've done a number of them myself, but they're cheap to do, and that you're doing okay with what your normal baseline is. That is good enough for me for that short-term period. In reality, what a lot of people will do is they'll bring, and I'm not trying to plug any one particular company here, but I happen to personally love iAdapt Airs and the Air Oasis brand because of the third-party research and how they're very forward-facing to the public, willing to do the research independent. They're spending real money to help answer real questions. I don't know any other company, and I have no financial ties with them, by the way, that you could bring there. Some of their equipment's very small, right? It's more portable, and that you would bring that with you to your hotel room. And not to get too much in the weeds, but some people are maybe thinking on the call here right now that, oh, where do I put it? Do I put this device 20 feet away in the corner in the hotel room? And my answer would be no. Put it as close as possible to your breathing zone. If it's in the case of a hotel room, that would be where you're sleeping, and put it near you so you can have a light airflow of HEPA filtered air going across your breathing zone to truly add another layer of protection. That seems to work for a majority of people, so long as they're not in a horrifically moldy hotel room.
I don't even know what to call the old style hotel room HVACs that are against the wall. I've stayed in hotels where those just look appalling. And I'm assuming it would be the same situation for something older like that, where not the mini splits, but the ones that are actually installed on the wall, usually under the window.
Yeah, they're basically like a package unit. They're all in one. They're like this
Yeah.
packaged air conditioning system where it's got the condensing unit in there. It's got everything. You just plug it into the wall. There's a little bit of install, right? But it's the same concept. To your point earlier, it really is the same as like a ductless mini split system where the condensing unit is in fact located outside and they run the refrigerant line to the mini split in the wall. The only difference between those two designs is that in the case of those old school hotel rooms or motel rooms, everything is in that box. And then they have some communication to the outside where it exhausts the warm air that it's removing, the heat that it's removing from the hotel room. So they both have their issues. And I've been in a number of places where I've been in some really old hotel rooms, and it's really tough to look for that perfection. If you're so sensitive, that is a real concern. You almost got to look at what's the priority for the travel. Do I want to wait? Do I need to travel right now? If I do travel, can I do something that's different than a hotel room? Like, again, I'm not trying to get all KOA campsite on everybody. Can I do something that's going to give me more freedom, like getting fresh air? Or if I am in a hotel room that's in a mild climate, can I open up the sliding glass door or the windows to bring in that fresh air? These are like cheap methods to dilute any sort of contaminant problem and really make you feel comfortable with the environment you're in for that short period of time.
If you suspect that the HVAC has an issue in a home, Airbnb, should you continue to run it or turn it off?
Ooh, tricky question. I think the normal first response answer is turn it off, because you're trying not to make it worse, the environment that is, that you're in, by keeping it running, this idea of cross-contamination. But there's two things to counter that point. If you're in a climate where turning off the HVAC system will cause secondary issues like a buildup of excess moisture, think about Miami, Florida again, in your home, and you leave it off for an extended period of time, days or longer, then you can create secondary issues of condensation and mold growing in your home that you otherwise didn't have if the AC was running with mold in the HVAC system. The other observation I will make is that consider the following. It's not like the mold that you see in this hypothetical situation in the evaporator coil, this quantity, if you will, of, let's just say mold spores, a term that most people understand. Let's say there were 1 million mold spores in that location. It doesn't mean that you have 1 million mold spores coming out of your ductwork. There might be just a little bit. Spore here, spores there, some fragments here coming out. And some of those, if not most of those, are going to settle out on the ductwork. In other words, they're never going to get into the airstream, into the living spaces. Some of them will, there's no doubt. We've seen it. But it's not, I think what I'm trying to tell you is a lot of times the visual evidence in an evaporator coil is more ominous feeling than in reality what it's actually doing to the environment. What it did to the environment, it probably already did, and there's not going to be a real substantial change between the time that you identified the mold and the time that you have it addressed. So to summarize all that in a clean little package, if you're not able to just straight up turn off because you're worried, maybe it's a heat issue too, and it's like you have nowhere else to go and you don't want to get a heat stroke in your house, or it is a moisture issue, like it's really humid here, we're in a warm Georgia, then what I would do is I would say as quickly as possible, continue to operate things otherwise as you need to for those other pieces to prevent that from happening, but seek out to an IEP, an indoor environmental professional, so we can try to customize a plan for you to really sequence and minimize contamination concerns.
This is all amazing information. I have one more question around HVACs, and it is related to just window units. If you're really in a pickle and stuck and you need to have aircon, but maybe your mini split's contaminated or something, what is your opinion on just shutting that down and getting an inexpensive window unit for a short period of time? I'm assuming new would be better than if you walked into a place that had a super old unit.
Yeah, cost is relevant, but to your point, let's assume it's worth it. A window mounted unit or these portable units with the ducting that you can hook up to, ironically, your window through these barriers, these plastic barriers that they install, because you got to have a place for that hot air to leave, can be a great way. In fact, is what we did to our home when our system turned down in our main house. It just went down. So I had one already and I turned it on, and what it did is it took the edge off. The problem is that they normally don't produce. If you're in a 400 square foot studio apartment, that might be an exception and you might be able to do that and provide reasonable cooling. But in
Yeah.
our case, if we wanted 78, 80 degrees in our house, we were able to get 85, 86. But here's the rub, it's 110 degrees outside. And yes, I think it's a great idea. Ideally, you'd go new. It's just a matter of, Melanie, and I know everyone probably gets this too, don't need to say it, but is it worth the cost? If you have to go to Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you go to purchase one of these units, it's subjective. You might go, let me tell you what the price of my comfort is. And then you might say it is real. That is a cheap solution. I think that if you're looking to maintain sanity while you figure things out, that is a very viable option because it might mean you're camping out in the living room or just one bedroom. But I
Yeah.
would argue that's better than nothing. I'd still have you keep an eye on your humidity moisture levels because if you have, say, a 2,500 square foot home and you stick one of those units to your point in the living room area, this common area, that common area might be marginally improved 80, 85 degrees, but your bedrooms or your other areas on the other side of your house, they're not going to get much of that cooling. It's going to feel really hot in there. And if it's humid, you really got to look at some temporary solutions. Sometimes I've seen people go, we're getting help. It's going to be addressed, but we can't get help for 2 weeks. And then they start saying, should we bring in a dehumidifier, which ironically is going to raise the temperature in the home, but you'll remove the moisture out. It doesn't have to feel overwhelming, but what you're hearing Melanie and I talk about is that there's a host of variety of situation that may have you go a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right with your fixes. But yes, get one of those units if they will provide you temporary cooling.
What is your ideal humidity percentage? What are you telling people right now?
We normally tell people around 35 to 50%, and you'll get a big swing there because of where you live. 50% is tough when you live in South Georgia, if you live in the Bahamas, really a warm tropical climate. A lot of times it's a heck of an effort to get down to 55%. But we typically say 30 to 50% for most people. And this is summertime numbers. This is when it's warm, there's more moisture in the air, and that's when that matters. In the wintertime, it's different. In fact, in the wintertime, typically the air is cooler, so it can't have as much moisture, and you'll sometimes flirt with the higher ranges unless you're in a dry state like us. You sometimes can get higher numbers. In the summertime, 30 to 50% if you can do it. If you're in a really tricky, humid climate, you might think that 55% is all you're going to do. What happens is if you go higher than that, it's not like mold's going to automatically start to grow, but you minimize the margins of that potentially happening. So if it's 56 or 55% relative humidity in the home, maybe that closet that has an exterior wall that doesn't get a lot of air movement and it's closed off is 65, 70%. And then you open up that closet door and voila, you have mold growing on your shoes and certain pieces of clothing. And you're going, why is that happening? I'm 55% in the home. You're not 55% in your closet. So this margin thing I'm talking about, if you can lower it enough, then when those other little areas will, relatively speaking, be lower too and minimize that growth from occurring.
Brilliant. All of that is accessible information, and I encourage people to take from that what works in their own situations. And if there's anything that's more complicated, of course, reach out to an indoor environmental professional to get that advice to make sure you're doing the right thing. But I think that helps people who are starting to figure out what they need. So I always ask people as we close out the podcast to answer some CIRS related questions. And is there anything else about HVACs you want to add in before we shift gears?
You and I could go on for hours about the intricacies of what ifs and other things that I know you on your personal journey went through. I think you've covered a lot of the fundamentals, the review, this idea of providing some basic guidance for the lay person to feel truly empowered to make some decisions, that they also have heard that we're not looking for, and I say this word carefully, mold free, but there is a difference between what would be otherwise a normal amount of maybe minimal mold growth in a drain pan that can easily be cleaned off the maintenance schedule versus a chronic systemic problem. Just know that. I think that's an empowering thing to help you because you want to make your option, you want to be safe, you want to be responsible when you're pursuing any, but you don't want to be so ridiculous that really the only solution is to move on Mars because we live on Earth, we're surrounded by moisture, we're surrounded by mold.
Yeah, thanks for that. That happened in my own experience. When I moved into my apartment, the drain pan, there was dust that had developed from the move-in process and the building process, and condensation on the drip pan that we had to test to look for microbial growth. And we've been able to clean it, maintain it, and hasn't been an issue since then. So that has been a huge relief. All right. So related to CIRS, what do you wish that people in the world knew about CIRS?
If we're talking about with respect here, the uneducated, uninformed, I think one thing that comes to mind instantly is the understanding of what low dose environmental exposure means. The traditional modeling of testing for mold is often confused by the uninformed to be enough to identify exposures for those who are more vulnerable, more susceptible. And the uneducated or uninformed, it's not an intelligence issue. It's just if you ask me how to work on my car engine, I'd be in bad shape right now. So it's this education of learning more about low dose environmental exposures that can sometimes translates into the forensics. What type of testing are you doing? The traditional community are using like spore trap samples. Most people know this that are in our community, or direct examination microscopy, basically looking under a microscope to analyze a spore trap that's not identifying the 300 to 1,000 or more fragments that exist per spore are flat out not being identified. And there's way more of these fragments in the environment. There are all these nice little pretty spores that we learned about in science class in elementary school. There is a little bit of a humanity, like passion piece about the kindness to it. Our world is so go now that a lot of times people who have CIRS, who have sensitivities, are felt like the rest of the community is going, you're crazy, quit being so sensitive. And we all struggle with some aspects of any of this stuff, but it's a very real thing. And if you are genetically susceptible, that just simply means that you may be more vulnerable to have a response, an adverse response, a symptom, or that sort of thing than the average Joe that maybe isn't Joe or Jane, right? Who doesn't have that type of exposure response to the same exact concentration. I wish people knew about that sensitivity. We're dealing with folks that can't remove toxins the way that a otherwise healthy or functional person in that specific aspect could. And unfortunately, we see a lot of projection. It's you should be like this person, and therefore you're just crazy and you don't have an issue in your apartment, but really you do. Education is key. I think the CIRS Institute, to be honest with you, is probably one of the most forward-facing educational piece. The fact that they're providing so much free information, I think, is one way to educate yourself first to be an ambassador, but then I wish the world would want to learn more about that. And I know that's a podcast for another time. And the other thing I wish I could explain to those people that suffer from CIRS, so say the patient, myself being one of them, is that to remember that we do live on Earth. I mentioned that before. In my experience, I feel like the problem is that there was this longest period of time where our community would be like, these people aren't taking it serious, right? Like, it was the grandpa or the husband that was like, just throw some bleach on it and call it good. And we're like, whoa, no, that doesn't solve your problem. And so we were really proactive. And I feel like in a lot of sense, our community has done a great job for those patients to let them know the seriousness of this exposure. And then we forgot to hit the brakes and find the other balance. And now we're having I'm seeing a rising observation of fear mongering. I'm seeing the limbic and vagal nerve responses by people I've experienced myself. And I feel like the truth is that while we might not know to the spore what can affect an individual, we need to be reminded that there is hope. You do live on Earth. You don't need to live in a bubble. We do want to honor your exposure. We certainly don't want to cut corners. That's what we do for a living, is don't cut corners, but remind the people that we're not talking about plutonium here. We're not talking about one spore, your arm's going to fall off. I think that I know I needed to hear more of that, because we have all these cheerleaders about fear, doom, and gloom and education, but who's saying the same thing, but in the same breath going, hey, it's going to be okay. We're not looking for perfection. So that's my tip of the hat to the community who are suffering through this. There is hope. You will get better. Follow the Shoemaker protocol. If you've been diagnosed with CIRS, you'll get to the finish line.
Beautiful. What would you like to say to the non-CIRS educated HVAC workers, mold inspectors? What would you like them to know or do better?
Oh man,
Without
right?
doing a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. 2 points. I wish that it's certainly with HVAC workers, I'll focus on them, that when it comes to cleaning, ductwork and the system, don't use chemicals. People are having just as many chemical reactions to the cleaning agents. Focus on either water, physical cleaning, removal, dish soap and water, if the manufacturer of the coil allows for it, but don't use antimicrobials, foaming agents that have these chemicals in them, because we have seen and experienced clients who can't go back into the home now because of that issue. And so that's tricky. And then the other thing I would, if I could talk to an HVAC worker or technician, is don't dismiss or conclude that there's not mold when there is, or that they downplay it. This happens almost all the time in hot, humid climates, where the HVAC worker will come out and say, oh, this is no big deal. We see this all the time. And you look as an inspector and it's everywhere. This may be normal, but it doesn't make it right. And so I would just do a break check that whether it's normal or not, I wouldn't conclude I would trust the CIRS patient more than the HVAC worker to make a conclusion about the status of the evaporator coil, which is why we want your involvement.
If you could have one magic wish granted, what would you want to happen right now within the CIRS community?
That we could heal quicker, that it didn't take years to correct what has probably been either something that you've been genetically susceptible for since birth, or something that has been building up in your body for years and it crept up. I wish that journey was shorter for people. For me personally, it was very scary. In hindsight, I understand a lot now. But in the time, I didn't know. I felt naked. I felt in the dark. I felt vulnerable. It's like falling in the dark and not even knowing what you're falling into, or being underwater. Not to like trigger people right now, but that's how it felt for me, because how did this creep up on me? I was fine. And now I'm not all of a sudden. And of course, your mind goes to dark places, because it must be something significant if I can't just pop a pill like an ibuprofen, a Tylenol to make it go away. If I could grant a wish, it would be that there was a way to heal people with CIRS quicker, so that you wouldn't have to go through this traumatic experience that some of you are going through right now.
Hear, hear. Last question. What kept you hopeful day to day when you were going through that journey, or what keeps you hopeful now?
Probably three things. First of all, faith in the protocol. Because I went through all the emotions. This isn't working. This is crap. These guys don't know what they're talking about. But I had less of those days than I had the hope. The second thing I did was working on my own limbic stuff. I realized I had high anxiety. A Genie test that came back with diagnosed PTSD. That was my highest upregulated gene, by the way. So the calm apps, the breathing exercises, whatever is your modality, your yoga, time for yourself, massage, whatever it is to release and let go, it is beyond therapeutic. That was what helped me. And I know our world, like politics, is very polarized when it comes to the spiritual discussions, but for me, it was God, it was faith. As a Christian, I found that personally, when I would get lost, there would be certain things and then it would work and other things wouldn't. And at the end of the day, there was only one thing that really made me feel comfortable and felt good. And that was my faith that everything was going to be okay, that I could reach up and ask for my peace, my comfort, the joy that my maker could make. So for me personally, faith at the end of it was probably the biggest thing, with these supplemental tools along the way to get me through the process.
Wow, Mike, thank you so much for sharing. I'm so sorry that you had to go through the significant journey that so many of us have had to experience, yet your personal knowledge and experience is going to help so many people as you work with them, because you can certainly relate to so many aspects of what people are going through. Thank you so much for your commitment to the CIRS community and the work you do. You bring a lot of integrity into the space. We are appreciative. Thank you so much for being here today. How can people stay in touch with you, and how do you want to share anything about the course too?
Thank you for that, Melanie. So three things. First thing, if people are looking for just general education, like a free resource of learning more about the fundamentals of a good inspection, the discussion pieces on the difference of mold testing options, proper remediation, like overview, these sorts of topics, go visit iepradio.com, the letters iepradio.com, and you'll find a bunch of references. It's a free resource for you that I host. If you're looking to work with me to any capacity, go to environmental analytics. That's one big long word, environmental analytics. Sorry, I couldn't make it shorter. .net. And if you go to the contact page, you can reach out to us, and we offer virtual consultations. That's what we do a lot of, or in-person site visits, which I'm doing more. I'm grateful, Melanie, that you brought up the course, the CIRS Institute, or CIRSX.com. If you go there, there's a button on the top left, and it's the Institute. And if you click on that, what you will run into is an educational course called Medically Important Remediation. So it's basically a certified course that you don't just get a badge attesting to you taking the course, but it's actually been recently approved for continuing education credits through a well-known remediation organization known as the IICRC. And that's a huge thing for this industry because you're not wasting your money. This course took myself and 4 or 5 other authors over 2 years to write. What the course is about is training professionals, mold remediation, aimed at the technician, but really meant for anybody wanting to learn more about how to properly remediate and clean a home. But beyond that, the sequencing talks about the HVAC system. That's one of the chapters I cover, talks about proper communication with patients and getting yourself familiar with what you might run into with your average CIRS patient. Talks about our own preparation. Did you just stop at a gas station and now you smell like gas fumes before you walk into all these preparatory things? It's an amazing course. It currently is being offered right now for $495 for 16 hours worth of incredible coursework. If you are somebody who's listening, you're like, I'm not going to become a mold remediator, but I really think it's worth doing it for the sake of my own education. There is a non-certified course. You don't have to take the quizzes and things of that nature to educate yourself as well. So go visit CIRSX.com to learn more about that.
Valuable resources. Thank you so much, Mike.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening and for your kind attention. To keep in touch, follow the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram. You can visit melaniepensack.com/the Heart of CIRS to donate. Your generosity helps to keep this podcast growing. May the awareness of CIRS spread far and wide, helping to change millions of lives for the better.